Greetings from the Carroll County line. We're back at Indiana University Kokomo today for whatever reason. But I wanted to tell you about lunch I had with my granddaughter last Saturday. We try to get together at least every other week. And I got 4 granddaughters, and this is number 3. She's in middle school at Northwestern. And, you know, it's neat because it gives me an opportunity to try and get into a 13-year-old girl's head a little bit, something that I guess I wasn't very good at when her aunt, our daughter, was 13 years old. So I'm making a little more of an effort now. And, you know, we talk about all sorts of things, her friends, what she did during the week. Eventually, usually gets around to her school, and last week I asked her about her classes and which ones she preferred. And after she ran down that list, she couldn't help but tell me which ones she didn't care for. And history was one of them. Well, history's important, so I asked her, you know, what is it about history that you don't like? She said, Grandpa, I just, you know, I have to memorize a bunch of dates of things that happened hundreds of years before I was born and try to memorize people's names that I can barely pronounce sometimes. And, you know, if that's how they're still teaching history in junior high school, like they did when I was at Maple Crest in, I don't know, 1960-something, I think they're missing the boat. Because history should be about stories. History should be about inspiring people. History should leave us in awe of what our heroes were able to accomplish with their courage and their perseverance. What people invented that made our lives better. History should also make us angry for all the mistakes that we've made. And sometimes history can bring people together in ways that you just don't expect. I'd like to share a story with you, but it needs a little preamble first. Everybody knows, I guess, because of Oppenheimer, that America developed the first atomic weapon to end World War II, and we did. Just a few days after we dropped a couple of bombs on cities in Japan, they chose to surrender unconditionally, and World War II was over. There was relative peace in the world for a few years until 1948, when the Soviets tested a bomb of their own. And so began the long, cold war. Which is largely misunderstood, I think, by people today. It was more than just an arms race where if we had 2 bombs, the Russians had to have 6, and if they had 6, we had to have 20, and on, and eventually, between the 2 nuclear superpowers of the world, we could have destroyed every living creature on the face of the earth. It was literally a prospect of madness. In fact, somebody came up with an acronym that for the whole thing, MAD, mutually assured destruction, and that's what it would have been. But the only way that either us or the Soviets could protect themselves was through a force of deterrence. The Soviets had to be convinced that if they ever attacked us, that we could totally obliterate them. And the responsibility for doing that fell upon the Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force. They were charged with building such an inextinguishably powerful force that they could survive a first strike and still deliver a devastating blow to the Soviets, literally turning their country into molten rock. It was really a terrifying time in the world's history. And there were a number of very formative weapons that were developed, probably rushed into production ahead of time before they were fully tested, with the sole purpose of scaring the Russians. And probably one of the most noteworthy was Convair's B-58 Hustler. This was a truly remarkable airplane. There were only 116 of them built with one purpose in mind: to drop a nuclear bomb on Russia. Half of the Hustler fleet was stationed at what was then Bunker Hill Air Force Base, now Grissom. The other half was down at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas for a while before they moved to Arkansas. So Grissom was a primary target for the Russians because we had a large part of the deterrence force based there. And I was stationed there in the 70s, and there was this little area of wooded ground where the prison is now that people were generally curious about because there was a chain link fence up around it and controlled area signs posted. Nobody was supposed to go in there, and the rumor was that there was a nuclear armed bomber that had wrecked, and when it crashed, the Air Force just dug a big hole and shoved the remains in there. It intrigued me for a number of years, long after I'd left the service. And because it was in the back of my mind, I had an opportunity to write a story which acquainted me with a woman in Texas who called me one day and asked me to help find her father. I'd like to tell you that story right now, this Cold War legacy, as a requiem for Rocky. Shemaine was coming home and would know the place for the first time. This daughter of a cold warrior was born in the base hospital just a few blocks away. And while she had no memory of it, was told that her parents and two older brothers had been happy together here. This is the last place any of them saw her father alive, but she couldn't remember. She was only 6 months old when it happened. Shemaine Plesko of Houston had been trying to find her way back here ever since. Air Force Captain Manuel Rocky Cervantes was killed during an alert drill on December 8, 1964. He'd lived only 29 years when his mother received an American flag in the mail, along with an impersonal letter of condolences from Colonel Paul K. Carleton, the commander of the 305th Bomb Wing at Bunker Hill Air Force Base. Rocky's wife had been told that her husband's death resulted from an unfortunate training accident. Some of the less informed blamed Rocky for his own demise. The Indianapolis Star lauded him as a Cold War hero, having sacrificed his life in the interest of our nation's peace. No less a casualty than if he'd been shot on the battlefield. And that was that. Virginia Cervantes moved her young family back to Texas. Shemaine would know her dad only through family stories and a few black and white photos. She spent 36 years wondering about the man who'd rubbed his wife's feet while she was pregnant, who possessed a sharp wit, an easy smile, and a rich sense of humor. The man who could never comfort her after a bad dream, attend her school functions, or walk her down the aisle at her wedding. And then they found his airplane. Half a century and less than a mile from where Shemaine was standing on a warm Indiana day, her dad had breakfast in the mostly underground alert facility at Bunker Hill Air Force Base. He wouldn't know that a snowstorm had almost shut the base down until he went outside with his pilot, Captain Larry Johnson, and his defense system operator, Captain Roger Hall, to conduct their daily pre-flight checks on aircraft number 60-1116. The fully cocked supersonic bomber was parked nearby, ready for an emergency engine start and loaded with 5 nuclear weapons. With the blowing snow limiting visibility on the runway, a KC-135 declared an in-flight emergency and asked for permission to land on the base. Bunker Hill was a Strategic Air Command, a SAC installation, and home to half of the supersonic nuclear strike fleet, the B-58 Hustler. Command ordinarily discouraged intruders for security reasons, but this pilot said he was in trouble. He wasn't. This kind of subterfuge was fairly common during a SAC operational readiness inspection. The inspection team would come up with some way to sneak onto the base and then wreak havoc for a week while inspectors tested every squadron against wartime conditions. Just minutes after landing, the SAC Inspector General was escorted to the command post where he presented Colonel Carleton with an execution order for a simulated emergency war plan mission. Timing was critical. A third of Bunker Hill's bombers and tankers were cocked on full alert. But before they could retaliate against a Soviet airstrike, they'd have to escape the base ahead of an attack. Planners estimated that the defense early warning system might give the air crews 15 minutes notice. The clock started ticking the moment Colonel Carleton received his orders. When the klaxons went off that Tuesday morning, Rocky ran for his airplane. Like a veteran fireman, he was used to it. Rocky'd been a SAC crew dog for 9 years. He excelled as a B-47 bombardier navigator while assigned at Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, before being reassigned to an exclusive Hustler crew with the 305th Bomb Wing at Bunker Hill in January 1962. But what Rocky, or anybody else, never got used to was the exhilaration that came from being part of a B-58 crew. It was elite and often dangerous duty. During the 8-year operational life of the Hustler at Grissom, 17 airmen were killed in accidents involving 11 bombers. Two of Rocky's best friends, Major William Barry and Captain William Bergdahl, burned to death a year earlier after they crashed during a landing. As they left the base hospital, Rocky had promised a friend that he would never die that way. Alert crews were regularly scrambled under simulated wartime conditions to make sure they could launch in the required 15 minutes. But as the crews strapped into the aircraft that morning, they had no way of knowing it was just another drill or a real nuclear war. In Rocky's bomber, Johnson and Hall started the engines while he began decoding the emergency action message. The crew lowered their overhead hatches as the crew chiefs pushed the boarding stairs clear. Johnson released his brakes and began rolling toward the runway. Their bomber would be at the end of a line of aircraft launching 8 seconds apart. Johnson would later testify that he saw a flash and the airplane lurched to the left. Then Hall looked out a small window over the left wing and saw flames. The whole wing was on fire, and Johnson ordered his crew to abandon the aircraft. The 3 overhead hatches blew off simultaneously. Now Johnson climbed out of his cockpit in the front of the airplane and over the windshield. The heat was so intense and the flames licked at his clothing as he crawled across the nose of the aircraft and then jumped down into the snow. Hall likewise, in the back seat, was able to climb out of his seat and over the wing and then jump into the snow. Rescues rolled him in the snow to put out his burning clothes, and although not seriously injured, he dislocated his shoulder in the fall. Rocky was right here in the middle. He had nowhere to go. Witnesses saw him briefly, like he was standing up in his seat to look outside. What he saw might have resembled the gates of hell. The Hustler was loaded with 14,000 gallons of military-grade jet fuel, and most of it was burning around the airplane. His position was forward of the wing, so he had nowhere to run. Rocky disappeared back inside. Seconds later, the rocket-propelled ejection capsule fired into the gray December sky, climbed until it disappeared in the falling snow, and then fell back onto the concrete taxiway, the parachute fluttering ineffectively in its trail. This ejection or escape pod had been developed to protect a hustler crew that had to get out of their 1,400 mile per hour airplane at 40,000 feet, where the temperature is 55 below zero and there's no oxygen. When activated, the pod would fold the crewmen inside and then slam shut to seal out the dangerous environment. It was very effective at high speeds and high altitude, but completely useless for a runway ejection because the parachute wouldn't have time to open. Colonel Carlton reported the accident to SAC headquarters as Broken Arrow, code for an accident or an incident involving nuclear weapons. Firefighters battled the flames for hours and 2 airmen were treated for injuries sustained during rescue operations. For the next 40 years, airmen would blame serious cancers on radiation exposure from the accident. Dense black smoke and flashing red lights were visible from Highway 31. Local media began to make inquiries. Initial releases reported a training accident that left a crewman dead. Based officials confirmed that the accident involved one of Bunker Hill's nuclear strike bombers, but claimed the airplane was unarmed and that there was no danger to the public. A news conference was scheduled for the next day. Engineers, weapons technicians, and firefighters worked to secure the accident site on a short strip of taxiway connecting the alert pads to the main runway. While the wreckage smoked and popped, the nuclear weapons were carried to a nearby ditch and buried in the sand. All 5 bombs were transferred to disposal facilities in Texas and Tennessee 16 days later. President Johnson asked Defense Secretary Robert McNamara about the incident during his daily briefing the following day. McNamara confirmed the death of a crewman and assured the president that while the nuclear weapons had been destroyed, there was no danger of radiation. He blamed the fire on a collapsed landing gear that had split a fuel tank open. He never mentioned Rocky's name to the president. General Everett Holston led the investigation and later reported that the high explosives in all 5 nuclear weapons had detonated. The aircraft and weapons wreckage burned for 2 hours. During recovery operations the next day, the secondary of one of the nuclear weapons burst into flames. It was extinguished, but then it happened again. The next day, when the secondary was moved, it ignited a 3rd time and was buried in the sand. He further reported that on December 8th, Dr. Henry Briggs and Hal Stocks from the Indiana Board of Health had been summoned and were at the scene of the accident until 8 o'clock. But when a 1996 Senate inquiry tried to confirm the health department's role, both men denied ever getting on the base. They said instead that they drove 6 hours through the ice and snowstorm to reach Bunker Hill, only to be turned away at the gate. Except for a young woman's journey to discover her father in a lonely stand of trees along the south side of the runway, the whole thing would have been forgotten. The base was renamed in honor of Hoosier astronaut Gus Grissom, and the remaining Hustler fleet was sold for scrap. A year before victory was declared in the long Cold War, somebody in the office of then Senator Indiana Richard Lugar recalled Rocky's accident and arranged for another Air Force investigation. Not only was the ditch along the taxiway still showing traces of radiation, so was an area of woods south of the runway. Adjoining fields were used in crop production, but the woods remained untouched. Nobody was allowed inside without the base commander's permission. 3 more years passed and Grissom Air Force Base downsized, opening up a substantial portion of former Air Force real estate for economic development. But like every other military base, there were a number of environmental concerns, not the least of which were the 2 radioactive sites. The Indiana Department of Environmental Management worked closely with Air Force officials to remediate both locations. Workers had just removed the trees in the woods and started digging when the crane began to uncover aircraft parts. First a section of landing gear, then an engine, then part of an ejection capsule. Before the evacuation was completed 3 weeks later, a team of historic aircraft experts had to be called in from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to identify the collection. They confirmed that the exhumed aircraft was a B-58, serial number 601116, Rocky's bomber. Exactly what happened that cold December morning in 1964 still remains a bit of a mystery. While anybody associated with the B-58 program will readily admit that the spindly nose gear and the airplanes was the airplane's Achilles heel, it's unlikely to have collapsed in taxi. It may, however, have snapped if the airplane collided with piles of frozen snow that had accumulated along the runway. The most popular theory, and the one supported by several eyewitnesses, is that the accident was a result of jet blast in an icy runway. The pilots were all in a big hurry to get airborne and had lined up for what SAC called a minimum interval takeoff launch. Since the hustlers had to deliver their devastating cargo all the way to the Soviet Union, they carried a tremendous reserve of fuel. Each bomber loaded a bulbous fuel tank mounted along the aircraft center line and just below the primary nuclear weapon. This mission pod, which also contained the 10 megaton nuclear weapon, hung very close to the ground. When the airplane in line of Rocky's bomber throttled up to enter the runway, the jet blast pushed his aircraft backwards on the ice. The crew was busy, and Johnson was most likely standing on his brakes. Nobody noticed that they were sliding until either a runway light ruptured the mission pod or the aircraft was moving so fast that the nose gear struck a chunk of ice and snapped. Either scenario could have caused the mission pod to rupture and spray 4,100 gallons of jet fuel into the hot exhaust. But in 2016, the whys and hows didn't matter all that much to Shemaine. She recognized that her dad was doing a dangerous job and that he understood and accepted the risks on behalf of his country. Now she'd have to try and understand as well. It was her quest to appreciate and a daughter's unquenchable love for her father that brought her back to where it all started. On Armed Forces Day weekend, 2016, just a few weeks before Father's Day, Shemaine and her husband Rick visited the Grissom Air Museum outside what used to be the main gate. Rocky's only daughter received a warm and heartfelt welcome in the museum's Hall of Honor. While tears streaked down the cheeks of her face, Shemaine graciously thanked a room full of visitors and helped preserve her dad's legacy. Perhaps because of the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death, the necessary level of Cold War secrecy and misinformation surrounding the incident, or the discovery of his wrecked bomber almost 4 decades after the accident, Rocky has come to epitomize the sacrifices of every Bunker Hill and Grissom airman. They were always cocked and prepared for war. Peace was their profession. You know, anytime we leave town and drive north, we're bound to wind up going past that air base up there. And we probably look at the airplanes sitting out in the air park at the museum and might consider that for a minute, or see the tankers sitting out on the ramp over on the reserve base. And certainly all of us, at least I do, always look up when I see a jet airplane flying overhead. And it's usually one of Grissom's tankers. But I wonder how many of us think about where those crews are going and when they're coming back. And what about the people that they've left here behind? So the next time you see somebody in uniform and want to thank them for their service, think of their families too. Till next time.